Now, there is a new report card out today for charter school authorizers. These are the organizations that decide who can open, expand, and maintain charter public schools in Michigan. The Education Trust Midwest graded them based on student achievement and improvement, and here are some of the highlights. 10 authorizers received an A or a B grade, among them Grand Rapids Public Schools and Grand Valley State University. However, 20% of charter schools that opened between 2011 and 2014 have authorizers who scored a D or an F. Detroit Public Schools, Oakland University, and Eastern Michigan are in that group. Now, the report is named Accountability for All, and the Education Trust Midwest says the poor performance by charter authorizers proves they aren't being held accountable. We've been talking about charter school authorizers accountability for a while now, and the Michigan Department of Education said that they were going to have some sort of standards or come out soon, but they've delayed that decision. Where are we right now, Nolan?
Well, I think we're not certainly with the Department of Education or the State Board of Education. They're not going to make the decision here. This is something the governor's working on. It's part of his overall plan for fixing education, not just in Detroit, but in troubled schools throughout the state. I say that about the Board of Education. They're famously hostile to charter schools, so they are not going to be the organization that decides this. But I think the one area that the governor is looking at now in terms of charter schools is making sure the authorizers are where they should be. And you look at this and you can say, yeah, 20% have a D or the F, but you have some of the bigger charter authorizers, particularly in Detroit. Grand Valley, I think, is the largest authorizer in Detroit, doing fairly well. And I think it's not as bad a scenario as perhaps it was painted. You have 20%, most of them smaller authorizers, who should be out of the business. And I think the governor's probably going to put them out of the business. But what's notable here is you do have some scrutiny of the folks who are supposed to be overseen. You lack that scrutiny anywhere else in public education in Michigan. And that's one of the benefits of charters.
You know, it's true that Grand Valley got a B, and they operate a lot of charter schools in Detroit. But Central Michigan University, which is another huge authorizer, was much lower on the list.
Got a C. I mean, it wasn't great, but it wasn't failing.
I think the narrative here comports with the narrative generally, which is that charter schools, some are good and some are okay and some are awful, and that on the whole, when you compare
that looks a lot like education.
It looks like
doesn't
everything.
Well.
And that's the problem, right? Because we were sold this idea of charter schools 20 years ago. I sat in the editorial boardroom at the Detroit Free Press with then Governor John Engler, who said, if we do this, two things will happen. There will be a plethora of quality choices for people, for parents in places like Detroit where they don't have them now, and the public schools in those places will be better than they are now because of the competition that they'll face from charter schools. And I think, again, we have to go back to that initial promise and start asking, is that what happened here? Is that where we are? And if we're not, how do we get to that point?
Well, we're obviously not at that point right now.
Well, it happened in, well, we're not completely at that point, but we've not seen a total failure of this. I mean, in fact, the report signals out some of the schools where, like UPrep Middle School, where 87% of the elementary school students are reading proficient. You don't see that anywhere else in the city. So you do have quality choices.
Chrysler Elementary has 100% of their kids doing that.
You do.
Bates Elementary has 100% of their kids.
You don't see that sort of performance throughout the public schools as you do in some of the better charters in the city. I mean, some of the best schools in the city remain charter schools. Some of the worst in the city
best schools in the city are public schools.
Okay, well, we can argue all day long what specific schools are doing well, and you will always have a bunch of schools that are doing better. But the question is, if you're a charter authorizer and you have 40 schools, and perhaps the majority of them, or you only have 5 of them, are good standouts, but you've got a bunch more who are at that middling level. And as a parent, when I hear a C grade, I'm not too thrilled about that. By the way, should you be able to? It depends. Well, should you be able to expand?
100% of the schools authorized by Detroit, or 100% of the authorizers of Detroit public schools are failing. I mean, the Detroit public school system is an abject failure, and these charters came to try to make up for that.
That's not accurate. the best schools, the highest performing schools in the city of Detroit are public schools. Chrysler
We're
Elementary.
not talking about the individual
Bates
schools. We're
Elementary.
talking about authorizers here. And if you look at the rest of the
Authorizers
schools,
of charter
you look
schools.
at the rest of the schools in Detroit, if you consider the Detroit public schools, the overseer of those, that's 100% failure
It's
in
not.
terms of the oversight. I mean, Detroit public schools
showed you-
are in emergency management, Steve.
Right.
That's been
That's
an
about-
abject failure.
that's
That's
about
why
the
you have so many
finances.
charter schools.
All right, well, let's get back, though, to...
And academic
Let's get back to the fact, though, should these charter school authorizers be able to continue to expand if they have this kind of grading? And we already had 11 that the superintendent of Michigan schools put on a kind of a warning list in, what, in August?
Yeah, I mean, I think the expansion question should be entirely off the table until we can figure out, again, it's been 20 years. It's time for a reasonable assessment of what has happened over that 20 years, where the performance of these schools compares with the promise. And there's no way to look at that and say anything other than we have come up way short. The question is now, what do you do to get closer to what we all thought we were getting?
Okay,
One of the things you look at in this report, some of the worst authorizers, which had just way too many schools. Some of the best ones had fewer schools. So maybe one of the things that the governor takes a look at here is limit growth or link growth to performance.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you have more authorizers with smaller numbers of schools. But you know, in terms of an overall indictment of the charter school system, I don't think this falls well short of that.
I don't think it's an overall indictment of the charter school system, but I'm always interested to see something like this because they take the numbers from the MED accountability scorecard. So then I often wonder, where does something like this go? So do lawmakers look at this study? Does the governor look at this study? When we put things out there like that,
I think it goes
where
into
does it
the
go
mix
then?
with, this is not the only measure of how charter schools are performing. It's just the latest, and it says pretty much the same thing that the others say, is that there's a wide range, and again, that the promise that we set out in 1994 hasn't been reached in 2015. And so it becomes part of the conversation about, okay, well, what are we going to change? How are we going to alter the structure, the infrastructure, so that good charter schools are allowed to not just continue to operate, but to build on what they're doing, and that bad charter schools are closed. That's a reasonable. Those are reasonable changes to the charter law, and we're headed in a different direction right now because we just took the cap off willy-nilly and said, well, you can open a charter school wherever you want.
The cap needed to be off, but you do need to put some scrutiny onto the authorizers. I think that's where the governor is going in terms of his reform proposal, because I think what you're going to see ultimately here, his idea is going to be to charter all schools in some fashion in the city of Detroit. You've got to do something to separate the debt from the schools, and I don't think you can hold the school system intact and do that. So I think you're going to see something along the order of what was done in Muskegon Heights, other places, and so getting the right authorizers in here will be crucial, because I think you're going to go to an all-charter system in Detroit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that won't sell with Detroiters who are skeptical of themselves are skeptical of the performance of charter schools. Parents who send their kids to these charter schools, if you look at how frequently parents change which school their kids are in because they got sold on, well, this school is doing this year, it's going to be fantastic. You go there, it's not very good, and you go to somewhere else. The dissatisfaction with all schools in Detroit has built to a point where nobody believes that there's any one kind of school that's superior to the other. So the all charter idea, I think, is probably where the governor is headed. I think you're right about that. I think he will have a hard time selling that to this group of Detroiters that are working on something else.
You've got to do something with this $600 million in debt.
Agreed.
And if you leave the schools intact, the debt stays there.
And so
you've got to separate the debt from the schools, and that's the way it's been done other places.
We will hear sometime at the end of March, beginning of April,
Supposedly.
sometime in the
March
spring.
31st, supposedly.